A woman named Vivian wrote to me last month, and I have not stopped thinking about her since. She said, "My husband was dead 11 days when my son-in-law walked in and told me I had 36 hours to find somewhere else to live." She left with one bag. Inside that bag, by accident, were papers that changed everything he thought he had won. What those papers led to, and what Vivian did with what she found, I need you to hear this. Grief makes you slow, and some people count on that. She had been a widow 11 days when the man who married her daughter sat down at her kitchen table and told her the house now belonged to him. He had the paperwork. She had 36 hours to go. His name was Derek Spall, licensed property manager, certified estate planner, a man who knew exactly which forms to file while a woman was still choosing between black dresses. He looked at her and saw nothing. A 71-year-old woman with one bag and no leverage. He was wrong. 40 miles north on a county road that did not appear on any map made after 2005, there was a white house with green shutters, bought for cash in 1978, never once mentioned in 47 years of marriage. In the lining of Vivian's bag, the one she packed while her hands shook, were the deed and a small brass key. She didn't find them until she was alone in a motel room in the dark. 3 months later, Derek Spall stood in a county courtroom and said the worst sentence of his life. He said it in front of her attorney, in front of the mayor of Millhaven, in front of her daughter, who had not understood what her husband had done. And Vivian Marsh stood up and answered him in 5 words. This is that story. Stay with me. On the morning of October 14th, a Thursday, Vivian Marsh sat at the kitchen table she had owned for 31 years and listened to her son-in-law explain that she did not own it anymore. He had come at 8 in the morning, not an afternoon call, not a message first. 8 in the morning, 11 days after her husband's burial, before she had eaten breakfast, before she had taken her blood pressure pill, before she had done anything except sit in her usual chair and hold a cup of coffee she could not taste. He knocked twice and let himself in through the back door. She had not given him a key. She had not needed to. His name was Derek Spall, licensed property manager, certified estate planner, based out of Carver County. He had married her daughter Renata 4 years ago at a garden venue south of town, and Vivian had tried, all 4 of those years, to believe that what she felt as coldness was only efficiency, that what read as calculation was just competence, that the way he sized up every room he walked into was a professional habit and not a character. On the morning of October 14th, she stopped trying. Derek sat down without being invited. He put a folder on the table and opened it and slid a single page toward her with the tips of his fingers, the way you slide something that will do the work for you. "I want to make this as easy as possible for you, Vivian," he said. He had a way of saying her name that made it feel like a category. "Your husband added Renata to the deed in 2019. She wasn't aware of the full legal implication. I'm sure you weren't either. But what it means is that as her spouse, I now hold a management interest in this property. Given the outstanding mortgage arrears my attorney has documented here, the cleanest path is for you to vacate within 36 hours so we can begin estate resolution." She had been a bookkeeper for 22 years. She read every word. Then she set the page down and picked up her coffee and held it in both hands and said quietly, "Does Renata know you're here?" Derek smiled the way a man smiles when he's already counted the money. "Renata and I discussed everything together," he said. "She wants what's best for the family going forward." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. She did not cry. She would cry later, alone, with the door locked. Not here, not once in front of this man. "I see," she said. 36 hours. "It's generous," Derek said. "The legal minimum in this county is 24. He stood. He straightened his jacket and he looked around the kitchen with the eyes of a man already calculating what to renovate and what to raise. And he said, pleasantly, as if he were doing her a favor, "You'll be more comfortable somewhere smaller anyway. A woman alone in a house this size is just rattling around." He let himself out. Vivian sat at her kitchen table for 23 minutes. She counted them on the clock above the stove. 47 years in this house. A son raised here. A garden she had planted and kept for 30 years. A husband nursed back from the hospital twice in this kitchen. And the word for all of that in Derek Spall's ledger was rattling around. She stood up, she rinsed her cup. She went upstairs to pack. She did not own a large suitcase. She found in the hall closet a canvas bag with a broken zipper on the outer pocket and a faded navy strap. She carried it to the bedroom and began the work of deciding what a life was worth fitting into one bag in 36 hours. She took her pills. She took the nightstand photograph, Bernard on the porch in 1987 squinting into the sun. She took the wool sweater that had been his and she was not leaving behind. She took her address book, her reading glasses, the wooden jewelry box from their 25th anniversary. She opened the bedside drawer and found, folded inside a birthday card from 2006 she had kept without knowing why, a slim white envelope, unsealed. Her name on the front in Bernard's handwriting. She did not open it. She was not capable of opening anything that required full attention. She put it in the bag without thinking, the way you pack what is in your hands when your hands are moving on their own. The taxi took her to the Lakeview Motel on the east side of Carver. Room 7. The carpet was an old deep brown. The lamp gave light without warmth. The window faced the parking lot. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a long time. She thought about Renata. Her daughter had stood at that garden venue 4 years ago in a white dress, and Vivian had danced with Bernard, and she had thought, I hope she is happy. I hope he is kind to her. She hadn't said it aloud because you do not say such things at a wedding. Now she wished she had said many things she hadn't. The room was very quiet. A car pulled in outside. Its headlights swept across the curtains and were gone. She thought about the kitchen table. The way Derek had straightened his jacket before he left. The way he had looked at the room, at the tile and the cabinet hardware and the window above the sink. The way a person looks at something they already own in their mind, already calculating what it costs to keep and what it costs to sell. She was 71 years old, and she had sat at that table and done nothing. She had said, I see, in 36 hours, as if she were confirming an appointment. She had packed a bag and called a taxi. She thought, was that the right thing? She thought, what else was there to do? She got up and splashed water on her face in the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Then she sat back down and opened the bag. The envelope was in the broken outer pocket, held shut with a safety pin she'd found in Bernard's sweater. She opened it. Inside, 2 typed notarized pages, a handwritten note, a small brass key on a red cord. The pages were a property deed. Filed August 22, 1978, Linden County Recorder's Office. Address, 14 Orchard Spur Road, Millhaven, Linden County. Buyer of record, B. Marsh. The note said, Viv, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you found it anyway. There's a key in here. You'll know what it's for. Don't let anyone tell you what it's worth before you've seen it yourself. I love you. I should have told you sooner. B. She read it once. She read it again. She said out loud to the empty room to Bernard, what did you do? She did not sleep. She lay with the deed on her chest and the key in her hand, and she thought about 47 years of a marriage she had believed she knew all the way through, and she could not yet decide whether she was angry or grateful or some third thing she did not have a name for. Just before she might have slept, her phone lit up. A text from an unknown number, but she recognized the voice in it. Derek. The deed filing may be incomplete without probate clearance. Don't take any action on secondary assets until you've spoken with the estate attorney. It's in everyone's interest that this be handled correctly. She put the phone face down. She closed her hand around the brass key. In the morning, she decided she would drive to Millhaven. Millhaven was 41 miles north of Carver, and on the morning of October 15th, a Friday, the road was the kind that runs through bare hills and open farmland, and makes you feel, if you are paying attention, that you are heading somewhere that has been patient. Vivian drove her own car, registered in her name alone. A detail from 1998 she was grateful for now in ways she couldn't have predicted. She left the Lakeview at 7 with the deed on the passenger seat and the brass key on the red cord around her neck. She had no GPS for Orchard Spur Road. The county map she had printed at the motel's front desk showed Millhaven, but not the road itself, which told her something already about how carefully this had been arranged. She stopped at a gas station on the edge of town. A man behind the counter, older, patient, the kind of man who has given directions to lost people for many years, squinted at the address and said, "Orchard Spur. That's the old Hennessy Lane. North on Route 9, 2 miles past the grain elevator. Look for the birch trees on the left. The turnoff isn't marked. People miss it." She thanked him and drove north. The birch trees were exactly where he said, a row of them, white-barked, holding their last pale leaves. The turnoff was unmarked. It ran between 2 rows of old apple trees, nearly bare, and at the end of the road, behind a low fieldstone wall, was a white house with green shutters. She sat in the car. She hadn't known what to expect. Something neglected, perhaps. Something whose disrepair would explain why it had never been mentioned. But it was not neglected. The paint was sound. The shutters were level. The apple trees had been pruned not very many years ago. This house had been cared for. She got out and walked to the front door. The ground was soft under her feet, wet from the week's rain. She noticed that the fieldstone wall at the edge of the road was solid, not crumbling. Someone had pointed it. Not recently, but in the last decade. Someone had kept it. She stood at the door for a moment before she tried the key. She pressed her hand flat against the wood. It was cold. It was the kind of cold that settles into old wood and old stone and does not leave until April. She thought, Bernard stood here. He stood exactly here, his hand on this door, for 20 years of Saturdays. She tried the brass key and it fit without hesitation, and the door opened and the air that came out was dry and cool, like a place that had been closed without being forgotten. She stepped inside. The house was furnished. That stopped her in the doorway. A small sofa, a wooden table and 2 chairs. A bookshelf along the far wall filled with books. A wool blanket folded over the sofa arm. A ceramic mug on the shelf beside the books. Clean, upright, the way you leave a mug when you plan to use it again. She walked through room by room. She was not in a hurry. She wanted to see all of it, every room, every surface. She wanted to know what Bernard had touched, what he had chosen, what he had left where. A bedroom, single bed, neatly made, a good wool blanket, a single lamp on the nightstand with the pull cord hanging. She pulled the cord once. The bulb came on. She turned it off. He had changed this bulb at some point. He had stood in this room and changed a light bulb and driven home and said nothing about it. A bathroom clean, the towels folded with care on the rack, a bar of soap, mostly unused, still in its paper wrapping, a kitchen with a good gas stove. She turned one burner on and off to confirm the gas worked, and it did, and a window above the sink that looked out on the backyard. She stood at that window for a moment. The backyard was 40 feet of long October grass, gone to seed at the tips, bending in the wind. And beyond it, built from the same fieldstone as the road wall, was a low-roofed solid stone outbuilding. The door faced the house, like it had been designed to be seen from the kitchen window. Like Bernard had stood at this same window and looked at that same door many times, thinking the same thing she was thinking now. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the outbuilding for a long time, and that was when she heard a voice from the front of the house. "Well, I wasn't expecting anyone today." A woman stood in the doorway. 65 or so, canvas jacket, work boots, a basket of late garden vegetables in one arm. She had the look of someone who had lived on this land her whole life and was not alarmed by most things. "My name is June Aldrich," she said. "I live on the property next east. I've been keeping an eye on this place since Bernard passed. I was sorry to hear about it. He was a good man." Vivian said, "You knew my husband." June came inside and set the basket on the kitchen table. 20 years, she said. "He came up most Saturdays, April through September. Sometimes just a few hours, sometimes the whole weekend. Very quiet man, very kind. I used to leave vegetables on the front step when the season ran long. 20 years. Most Saturdays. For 20 years, Bernard had driven 41 miles north, and she had thought he simply had his Saturdays the way some men do, quietly, to themselves. She had never pressed him. She had never thought to. He talked about you, June said. More than you might expect. He said once that he had one real regret in 40-some years of marriage. He said it was every time he hadn't said thank you when he should have. Vivian put her hand flat on the kitchen table. She steadied herself there. June put the kettle on without asking, because she was the kind of woman who understood that some moments require tea regardless of whether it has been requested. While the kettle heated, Vivian looked at the bookshelf. On the end of the second shelf, between two books, was a small ceramic pot, the kind used for pins or buttons or small kept things. Inside, it was a small iron key on a plain loop. He told me once, June said, coming to stand beside her, that if anything happened to him, there was a key somewhere I would know to look. I think he wanted someone here who would recognize you when you came. He seemed very certain you would come. He was right, Vivian said. They walked out together through the long October grass. The air smelled of damp earth and the last of the apples still on the branches. Vivian put the iron key in the lock of the stone outbuilding. It turned. The door swung in. The air inside was cold and dry and faintly sweet, like paper kept in a dark place for a long time, like something preserved on purpose. She stood in the doorway until her eyes adjusted. Two small high windows on the far wall, not large, set high in the stone, the kind of windows that let in light but kept out weather and prying eyes. A stone floor, stone walls, a wooden work table along one side, well-built, level, the kind a man makes when he intends it to last. The air smelled of stone and dry wood and something faintly metallic. Not unpleasant. The smell of a place that had been used with care for a long time, and shelves, 3 of them, built directly into the stone, running the full width of the room. Not rough shelves. Finished shelves, sanded smooth with a small lip at the front of each one so that nothing could slide off. He had built these shelves, she thought. Bernard had built these. He had sanded them. He had cut the lips. She could see where the wood had been fitted to the irregular surface of the stone wall, cut and fitted by hand, patient work, the work of a man who did things properly and took his time. On the shelves, small framed things, some covered with cloth, the cloth of pale linen she did not recognize. Rolled canvases in protective tubes, labeled in his handwriting, and wooden cases are narrow, long, sealed with small brass clasps, 14 of them stacked in pairs along the lower shelf. At eye level on the center shelf, propped to face the door, was a photograph. Vivian in a garden. She was 40, perhaps 45, kneeling beside a rose bush in a yellow shirt, looking up at the camera, laughing at something someone had said. She had never seen this photograph before. She looked at it for a long time in the pale window light. Her hands dropped to her sides. Then her legs did the thing legs sometimes do when a person has been standing too long on insufficient sleep holding too much. They simply stopped cooperating and she sat down on the stone floor right there in the doorway, not because she chose to, but because her body made the decision before she could. She sat on the cold stone and looked at the photograph from that angle, which was lower than she'd expected. And she looked at herself kneeling in the garden in the yellow shirt, young, laughing, and she thought, he had this here. He sat with this. She could not speak. After a while, she got back up slowly, one hand on the doorframe. Then she went to the lower shelf and unclasped the nearest case. Inside, fitted in foam lining cut precisely for it, was a small painting. Oil on panels small enough to hold in both hands. A street scene. Buildings that looked European, a style that was clearly not modern. In the lid of the case, a small card, Flemish, circa 1890. Provenance attached. She did not know what that meant yet. She could feel that it meant something large. She closed the case. She held it in both hands. She looked at the shelves. 14 cases, 9 canvases, 5 frame pieces. And she felt, for the first time in 11 days, something she recognized as clarity. The kind that comes when a situation is much larger than it appeared, and the only right response is to stop and proceed with care. She would need someone who knew what they were looking at, and she would need that person before Derek Spall found out why she had not answered his text. She looked at June in the doorway. "Can I stay tonight?" "Of course," June said. "The bed is made." She did not go back to Carver. She sat in the outbuilding as the afternoon light moved through the high windows and spread across the stone floor, and she counted everything again to be sure she had it right. 14 cases, 9 canvases, 5 frame pieces. She thought about Bernard on a Saturday in April, turning off Route 9, parking on the gravel, walking to this door. She thought about 20 years of Saturdays she had never asked about. At some point, June brought her a cup of tea and set it on the work table and went back to the house without being asked to leave. That was the kind of person June was. She picked up the tea and held it in both hands, and she looked at the shelves in the dimming light, and she thought, "What did you do, Bernard? What exactly did you do, and why did you never show me?" She thought about the note. "I should have told you sooner," those 6 words. He had written them and sealed them in an envelope and put them in a drawer, and that was the closest he had ever come to an explanation. She did not yet know what any of it was worth, but she knew with the kind of certainty that arrives before you can prove it, that Bernard had not left her with nothing. And Derek Spall, on the other end of an unanswered phone, did not know yet that on the morning of October 14th, he had made the worst miscalculation of his life. She called Thomas on Saturday morning from the kitchen of the White House, sitting at the wooden table with the deed in front of her and the iron key between her palms, and she told him everything from the beginning. Derek at the kitchen table on Thursday morning, the bag she packed in 36 hours, the motel room, the envelope, the deed, the drive north, the birch trees at the turnoff, June in the doorway with her basket of vegetables, the outbuilding, the shelves, the 14 cases, the photograph of herself in the yellow shirt. The telling took 24 minutes. Thomas was quiet for 18 of them. Then he said, "Mom, are you safe right now?" She said, "Yes. I'm somewhere that's mine and I'm safe." A pause, then, "I'm coming up." He arrived that afternoon, 3 hours of highway driving without stopping, and he walked into the White House on Orchard Spur Road and stood in the middle of the living room and took in the furniture and the bookshelf and the wool blanket on the sofa arm. He did not say anything right away. He stood there and he looked at the room the way you look at a room that belongs to someone you did not know existed. Then he looked at his mother. There was a long moment between them. Thomas had known his father as a quiet man, a good man, a man who showed love by fixing things and showing up on time and never missing a school event in 20 years. He had not known this. He had not known any of this. And Vivian watched her son's face as the room and what it meant began to arrive in him, and she thought, "We are both learning him, both of us, together." He went and put his arms around her and said nothing at all. They stood like that for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Show me the outbuilding." She took him across the yard and unlocked the door, and he went to the nearest wooden case and opened it and read the provenance card and stood very still. He said quietly, "We need someone who knows what they're looking at, an expert, before anyone else finds out this room exists." He was exactly right. June consulted over the back fence that evening while Thomas made dinner in the small kitchen, said without any pause, "Carol Veith. She's in Linden City, 40 minutes south. Property attorney. But before she went to law school, she spent 11 years as a certified fine art appraiser at Christie's in New York. She came back up here about 15 years ago. She's the best there is for something like this, and Bernard knew her, at least by name. He mentioned her once or twice over the years." Monday morning, Vivian and Thomas drove to Linden City with 2 of the wooden cases in the back seat. Neither of them spoke much on the drive. Vivian kept her hands in her lap and watched the road and thought about how strange it was to carry something 40 years old in the back seat of a car on a Monday morning and not know what it was worth. Thomas drove the way his father drove. Steady, both hands, no radio. She noticed that and did not say anything about it. Carol Voth's office was on the second floor of a building near the Linden City County Library. 2 rooms, organized and spare, walls of reference books and law volumes and flat files for documents, a large, clean desk under a north-facing window that let in good, even light. One wall held framed certificates, her law degree, her appraisal credentials, a commendation from Christie's dated 1998. It was the office of a woman who had done 2 careers with equal seriousness. Carol Vaith was 58 years old, wearing reading glasses on a chain, with the focused attention of someone who has spent decades learning to look at things very carefully. She opened both cases. She studied the paintings and the provenance cards, held one to the window, set them both on her desk, and looked at Vivian over her glasses and said, "Where did these come from?" She told her the short version: the husband, the property, the outbuilding, the shelves. She listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How many total pieces?" She told her, 14 cases, 9 canvases, 5 framed. She was quiet. "Mrs. Marsh, I want to be precise with you because I think you deserve it right now." He lifted the first painting. "This is authentic, well documented, and in good condition. The provenance chain is solid. At current market, this piece opens between $40,000 and $50,000. She set it down. She picked up the second. He read the provenance card twice. He looked at the painting at 3 different angles. He looked at Vivian. "This one requires more work before I give you a number. If it is what the card indicates, it is worth considerably more." She removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I need to see everything in context. I need to come to the property, this week if possible." They went on Tuesday. Carol spent 4.5 hours in the stone outbuilding. She opened every case. She examined every rolled canvas on the work table. She lifted the cloth from every frame piece. She made notes in a small leather notebook and did not speak much while she worked, except once. When she unrolled the 3rd canvas, the large one, and spread it flat on the table and stepped back and looked at it for a full minute and then said, very quietly, to no one, "Bernard." Just the name. Nothing else. Then she turned and looked at Vivian and said, "You didn't know about any of this." "No," she said. Carol nodded slowly. "He was protecting it," Carol said. "The anonymous deed, the cash purchase, the provenance papers kept separately. He was protecting it. From something he saw coming, maybe? Or from the simple uncertainty of what comes after a long life. I can't say which. Possibly both." She closed her notebook. She looked at the shelves for a long moment. "Preliminary range today, full appraisal in 2 weeks." She paused. She chose her next words with care, the way you choose words you know will matter. "The preliminary range is significantly higher than you are expecting. Based on what I can see today, the total collection is likely between $400,000 and $600,000. 2 canvases need further authentication before I can tighten the number. One of them, the 3rd one, the large one, I'd like to send photographs to a colleague in Philadelphia who specializes in this period. If it is what I believe it may be, that single canvas changes the total substantially." Thomas put his hand on Vivian's shoulder. Carol was watching her with the careful expression of someone who has delivered large numbers to people before and understands that the number is rarely the most important part. Vivian stood at the shelf with her hands at her sides. Outside, wind moved through the apple trees and a handful of leaves came loose and drifted past the high window. She thought about Bernard in this room, on a Saturday in April, standing where she stood now, 20 years of Saturdays. She thought, "I am trying to understand you, Bernard. I don't know yet whether I am angry." And then the almost surrender, which had been gathering since the Lakeview Motel, since the night she lay in the dark with the key in her palm. It came now, fully and all at once, while Carol and Thomas were outside, and she was alone in the stone room with the shelves. She sat down on the wooden stool near the door. She put her hands flat on her knees. She breathed once, slowly. The stone room was very still. Outside, she could hear the wind in the apple trees and nothing else. She said out loud to Bernard, to the cold room, to herself, I am afraid that I spent 47 years trusting a man who kept a secret this large, and I am afraid that means I did not know him. And if I did not know him, then I am afraid that what I believe my life was and what my life actually was are two different things, and I do not know how to hold that. I am afraid I came up here to find something, and instead I found out how much I was missing. I am afraid that whatever Carol tells me about the value of these things will not give back what was taken. Not the house, not the 11 days, not the 36 hours of packing while my hands shook. I am afraid that even if all of this is worth everything he thinks it is, I am still 71 years old, sitting on a stool in a building I've never been in, looking at objects I've never seen, left to me by a man who is not here to explain himself. And the worst one, Bernard, I am afraid that you thought you were protecting me, and I am too angry right now to receive it. I am afraid the anger outlasts the grief, and I waste something I cannot recover. I am afraid that you love me in a language I couldn't read, and now you're gone, and I will spend the rest of my life learning it. She stopped. She sat with the words in the cold room. Her hands were still flat on her knees. The stone floor was hard and the stool was not comfortable, and she noticed these things in the way you notice physical facts when your mind is very full. She sat there for a while longer. The wind moved through the apple trees and she listened to it. Then something else arrived. Not resolution, not peace, something simpler than either of those, exhaustion. The plain exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying too much for too many days and whose body has finally decided that the fear is allowed to rest for a moment. She breathed. Outside, wind came through the apple trees again. She could hear Thomas's voice in the distance, calm, certain, talking to someone on his phone, and his voice had the exact tone his father's voice had when Bernard was working on a problem he already knew had a solution. She had heard that voice for 47 years. Here it was again, living in her son. She looked at the photograph of herself in the yellow shirt, young, kneeling in a garden, laughing. He had driven 41 miles to hang that photograph in this room. He had done it and then kept doing it, every Saturday for 20 years, caring for this place and everything in it, arranging it for her, waiting for her. He had known, in his silent and imperfect and quietly faithful way, that she would come when she needed to. That was not the act of a man who had not known her. That was the act of a man who had known her entirely and loved her in the only language available to him. She was not all right yet, but she stood up from the stool. She straightened her jacket. She walked outside into the October air and said to Thomas, "Tell whoever you're on with that we need a property attorney. Good one, this county." Thomas looked at her for a moment, the particular look of a son who has been watching his mother carefully for 4 days. He said, "That's who I've been talking to for the last 10 minutes. What neither of them knew on that Tuesday afternoon was that Derek Spall had already found out Vivian had not stayed at the Lakeview, that she had gone north, that a property in Linden County appeared to be involved. He did not yet know about the outbuilding. He did not know about Carol Veith. But he had begun to revise his calculation, and when Derek Spall revised the calculation, it meant he was going to move fast. And when he moved fast, it was never in anyone else's direction. His second appearance came on Wednesday. He drove to Millhaven himself, which told Vivian everything she needed to know about how seriously he had started to take this. She saw his car from the kitchen window before he knocked, the silver sedan, immaculate, parked with precision on the gravel. And she had a moment, just a moment, to prepare herself. She set down her coffee cup. She straightened her back. She thought, he is going to sit down across from me, and he is going to act as though nothing has changed. And she thought, let him. He knocked on the White House door, and Thomas answered, and Derek looked past him and found Vivian with his eyes and said, "Vivian, I think we should talk about this property." There may be some confusion about what's covered under the estate and what isn't. My attorney would like to resolve this before it gets complicated. His tone was exactly the same as it had been at the kitchen table in Carver. Measured, pleasant, helpful. The tone of a man who has decided he is the most reasonable person in any room he enters. He came in. He sat down across from Vivian. Same geometry as the Carver kitchen table 11 days ago. Same folder in his hands. And he put a new document in front of her. The estate may have a claim on assets acquired during the marriage, including undisclosed property. We filed a preliminary injunction to pause any sale or transfer at this address until estate resolution. Our opening figure, based on assessed county property value, is around $40,000. That's a fair resolution, and I'd encourage you to take it now before additional legal costs for everyone. He said the $40,000 as if he'd already decided it was the ceiling. And then, because he was Derek Spall, because he had said something like it once at the kitchen table and apparently believed it worth saying again, I just want to make sure you understand your position, Vivian. You're 71 years old. You're alone in a county you don't live in. This property has no established market value. My offer is the realistic one. June sat at the kitchen table with her coffee cup in both hands. She looked at Vivian and said nothing. Thomas said nothing. Vivian said, I'll need to speak with my attorney. After Derek left, Thomas closed the front door and stood with his back against it for a moment. June picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at the table. The three of them were quiet. Outside, Derek's silver car reversed down the gravel road and was gone. Thomas said, I don't like the way he talks to you. Vivian said, I know. She had known for 4 years. She had simply not known what to do about it. Thomas said, Carol Vaith is good. She's already filed the challenge. By the time he figures out what we actually have, it'll be too late for him to get out ahead of it. Vivian looked at him. Her son. Working the problem the way Bernard worked problems. Steady and certain and without drama, she thought, we are going to be all right. She thought, I believe that now. She said, good. June set her cup down on the table very quietly and said, Carol called while you were talking. She heard back from Philadelphia. Vivian looked at her. She'd like to meet Thursday morning, June said. She told me to tell you, and I'm quoting her exactly. The number has changed. The meeting with Carol Vaith on Thursday morning was in the Stone Outbuilding because Carol said the light was better there for what she needed to show her. She had driven from Linden City and brought printed photographs and a letter on official letterhead from a specialist in American and European genre painting at a Philadelphia auction house. He spread the photographs on the work table. He said, I want to walk you through this precisely. She picked up the photograph of the third canvas, the large one, the one that had made her say Bernard's name in a quiet voice on Tuesday. This is a work by a Dutch genre painter who was moderately known in his own lifetime and became significantly more valued beginning in the 1980s, when a number of his works were traced from private collections and authenticated. He died in 1912. This particular canvas, the provenance tracks to an Amsterdam private collection, dispersed in 1976. The sale record shows it was purchased at auction in 1978 by a private buyer who paid cash and gave an American address. He paused. He looked at Vivian. That is consistent with the date on this property's deed and with what you told me about Bernard's habits. The documentation he kept is complete and legitimate. My colleague in Philadelphia has reviewed the photographs and confirmed the attribution. He estimates this canvas alone between $200,000 and $250,000. The room was quiet. Wind moved through the apple trees outside and shook the last leaves free. Thomas sat down on the wooden stool. June, who had come because Vivian asked and she had said yes without pause, put her hand briefly over her mouth and took it away. Vivian stood at the shelf with her hands at her sides. She looked at the photographs. She looked at the letter. She said, he started this in 1978. Yes, Carol said. The earliest provenance documents date to that year. He built the collection over roughly 30 years. The purchases appear to have stopped around 2005, perhaps when he retired or perhaps when he decided it was complete. He never told me, Vivian said. Carol was careful with what she said next. I think he was afraid you would say it was too much. Too much money held separately. Too much of his inner life devoted to something outside the family. I've known men like Bernard in this work. They love deeply and protect quietly, and they are not always good at explaining their reasons while they're acting on them. I'm guessing, but that's my sense of him. He was not always good at explaining, Vivian said. And she said it without bitterness, because it was true, and because the truth of him was something she was not going to flatten in either direction. He was Bernard, complicated, loving, silent, and hers. Carol picked up the second sheet from Philadelphia. My revised total estimate for the collection is between $800,000 and $1.1 million. He let the number sit for a moment. I want you to hear it, and then I want to give you time to take it in before we talk about what comes next. And I want you to understand what Vivian did at this moment. She didn't cry. She didn't sit down. She looked at the shelves, everything Bernard had arranged with such care in this stone room, and she said, to no one in particular, he knew I would find it. The property attorney Vivian and Thomas retained was a woman named Carol Vaith, based in Linden City, who had practiced estate and probate law for 30 years and who had the manner of someone who has seen many versions of this situation and has stopped being surprised by the audacity of people who file paperwork while a widow is still choosing a headstone. Vivian spoke with her by phone on the Tuesday after the Thursday meeting with Carol, and she gave Carol the same account she had given Thomas, the full version from the kitchen table in Carver to the outbuilding to Derek's second visit at the White House. And Carol listened without interrupting. And when Vivian finished, she said, I want you to send me everything. The deed, the provenance documents, the appraisal, all of it. Give me 2 days. 2 days later, Carol called back. She reviewed the full documentation and delivered her assessment without softening it in any direction, because she was not that kind of attorney. Derek Spall's paperwork is aggressive, Carol said, but significantly weaker than he represented it to you. The 2019 deed amendment was real, and Renata's name was on it. But the management interest Derek claimed as a spouse was not automatic under current county law, and the mortgage arrears he had cited were overstated. More critically, Bernard had purchased the Millhaven property with funds from a separate savings account he had maintained since before the marriage. She had the bank records now, pulled from the estate documents. Under Linden County probate law, a property purchased entirely with premarital or independently held funds did not automatically become a marital asset. Derek's estate claim on the Millhaven property, Carol said, was almost certainly going to fail. Carol Vaith filed the formal challenge within 4 days of being retained. She documented the separate account, the purchase date, the cash transaction, and the provenance chain. She entered her own preliminary appraisal as supporting evidence. She established clearly and completely that the Millhaven purchase predated any jointly held financial arrangement between Bernard and his wife. Derek Spall's attorney received the updated documentation on a Tuesday morning. Derek Spall appeared in person the following Thursday in Linden County Family Court, Courtroom 4B, 9 o'clock in the morning. A summary hearing on the estate claim. He appeared with his own attorney and with the confidence of a man who still believed he was managing the situation. The room was not large. It had the particular quality of a county courtroom that has seen many ordinary lives turn on ordinary documents, a worn wooden gallery, good plain light from the windows, the particular hush of a room that knows it sometimes matters. Vivian arrived early with Carol, and she sat in the plaintiff's chair and looked at the empty gallery for a moment before people came in. And she thought about all the mornings she had sat at her kitchen table in Carver with her coffee and the newspaper, all the mornings that had felt permanent. None of them had been permanent. She was here instead, in a courtroom she had never seen before October. And the person who had built this situation was in the ground in Linden County. And the person who had tried to take from it was about to walk through that door. She straightened her spine. Carol Vaith was at the plaintiff's table. Thomas was in the gallery, second row. June Aldrich was beside him in her good coat, because Vivian had asked her to come and June had not hesitated. Robert Drexel was there, the mayor of Millhaven, 68 years old, who had known Bernard as an occasional quiet presence in the town for 15 years, and had come when June called him because he believed this was something the town should have a witness to. And Renata was there. She had driven up on her own without telling Derek. She had called Thomas the night before, and Thomas had told her carefully what had been found and what Carol's revised estimate was, and Renata had been quiet for a long time. In the morning, she had driven alone to Millhaven, and she had sat beside her mother before the hearing, and she had said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know what he was doing. I need you to know I didn't know." And Vivian had looked at her daughter and said, "I know." They had held hands, and it was not everything, and it was not nothing, and it was a beginning. The hearing proceeded through the evidence. Carol Vaith presented the documentation. Derek Spall's attorney made the argument about marital assets. Carol's counterargument was 14 pages and referenced 4 case precedents in Linden County alone. The judge read the materials. At approximately 9:45, Derek Spall leaned toward his attorney and spoke briefly. His attorney responded in the tone of someone trying to quietly manage the person who hired them. And then Derek Spall stood up. He looked across the courtroom at Vivian. At Vivian in her good gray coat, at her attorney's side with Thomas and Renata and June and Robert Drexel in the gallery behind her. And he said loudly enough that no one in courtroom 4B had to strain to hear it. "She doesn't even know what she has. She never would have found it without the documents falling into her lap by accident. She stumbled into this like she stumbles through everything. She's always been the passenger, not the driver." The room went quiet. The particular quiet of a room where everyone has heard something they will not forget. Thomas's jaw tightened. Carol Vaith looked at the table for 1 second and then looked up. June looked at her hands. Renata's eyes closed for a moment and opened. Robert Drexel looked straight ahead with the expression of a man who is recording exactly what he is hearing. Derek Spall's own attorney set down his pen and did not pick it up again. And Vivian Marsh stood up. She stood up slowly, the way you stand when 11 days have been carrying you toward a single moment. She was not going to perform anger for this man. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of her volume. She looked at him across the courtroom and she said, quietly, in a voice every person in that room could hear without straining, "He knew I would find it." 5 words. Level. True. No performance. Just the fact of Bernard, who had driven 41 miles every Saturday for 20 years, who had hung her photograph on a shelf in a stone room full of things he had protected for decades, who had left a brass key in an envelope with her name on the front, who had known in his imperfect and faithful and wordless way exactly what he was building and who it was for. Derek Spall had no answer for it. His attorney offered nothing. The judge restored order. The proceeding continued. 11 days later, the ruling came. The Millhaven property and all its contents were the sole property of Vivian Marsh, fully independent of the marital estate under Linden County probate law. The preliminary injunction Derek Spall had filed was dismissed. The estate claim on the Carver house was partially upheld. Renata's name was legitimately on the deed, but Carol Vaith negotiated a structured settlement in which Vivian received 40% of the Carver property's assessed value in cash, money neither of them had expected to recover at all. Derek Spall's professional relationship with Renata did not survive the autumn. Renata filed for separation in November and retained her own attorney, and she called Vivian every Sunday after that, and Vivian answered every time. 11 days later, the ruling came. Vivian was at the kitchen table in the White House when Carol called, and she heard the result and she said, "Thank you." And she set the phone down on the table and she sat for a moment in the quiet of the small house on Orchard Spur Road. Then she stood up and walked out to the backyard and looked at the stone outbuilding and she said out loud to no one and to Bernard, "We won." It was the only thing she could think to say, and it felt right. It had been his fight too, in its way. He had built the room, he had kept it, he had left the key. The Mill Haven property and all its contents were the sole property of Vivian Marsh, fully independent of the marital estate under Linden County probate law. The preliminary injunction Derek Spall had filed was dismissed. The estate claim on the Carver house was partially upheld. Renata's name was legitimately on the deed, but Carol Vaith negotiated a structured settlement in which Vivian received 40% of the Carver property's assessed value in cash, a figure neither of them had expected to recover at all. It was not the house. It would never be the house again. But it was something. It was proof that the kitchen table had not been the whole story. Derek Spall's professional relationship with Renata did not survive the autumn. Renata filed for separation in November and retained her own attorney, and she called Vivian every Sunday after that, and Vivian answered every time. They did not talk about Derek. They talked about Thomas, about the house in Mill Haven, about the watercolor above the kitchen table. They talked about Bernard sometimes, carefully, the way you talk about someone when you are both still learning who he was. Carol managed the private sale of 12 of the 14 pieces over the following 8 months. The collection was sold through a private dealer, not at auction, to preserve the provenance chain and protect the values. The final documented total was just over $1.1 million. 2 pieces Vivian did not sell. One was the Dutch canvas, the large one that had made Carol say Bernard's name in a quiet voice. She kept it because Bernard had kept it for nearly 30 years, and it belonged in this room, and she was not ready to send it somewhere she had never been. The second was a small watercolor she found behind the other cases, on the lowest shelf unwrapped, in a simple wooden frame. A painting of a garden. Not her garden, but a garden with rose bushes and afternoon light. And the brushwork was warm and old, and the colors had the faded gentleness of something made a long time ago by someone who meant it. On the back, in Bernard's handwriting, "For Viv, found this at the Hennessy auction, June 1983. Looked like your garden in summer. Always meant to give it to you, always ran out of the right moment." She stood in the stone outbuilding with the watercolor in both hands, and she looked at his handwriting and she thought, 40 years you were going to give me this, 40 years of the right moment failing to arrive. He had bought it in 1983 and carried it 41 miles and hung it on a shelf and looked at it for 20 years of Saturdays instead. She was not angry at him anymore. Or rather, she was, a little, still, and she thought that was fair, and she believed Bernard would have agreed. She hung the watercolor in the kitchen of the White House on Orchard Spur Road above the table, where the morning light found it every day. In the spring, she moved in. She hired a local man to maintain the apple trees and replant the garden along the south wall. She and June Aldrich drank tea on weekend mornings and talked about Bernard honestly, what he had been, what he had not been, the way you talk about someone once the grief has done its hardest work and left behind something more complicated and more true than sadness. In April, Carol Vaith called. There was a woman in Carver County named Helen Price, 68 years old, widowed in February. Her late husband's adult son claiming rights to the property Helen had lived in for 31 years. The son had legal counsel. Helen had no one yet. Carol was already on it. She just wanted Vivian to know. Vivian said, without hesitating, "I'll cover the retainer." She meant it without drama. It was simply the obvious thing to do. Someone had once left her a brass key and a red cord and a note that said, "Don't let anyone tell you what it's worth." The least she could do was pass that forward in the only language available to her, which was action and money and a letter written by hand. Then she sat down at the kitchen table under the watercolor of the garden in summer light, and she wrote Helen Price a letter on notepaper with a pen from the ceramic pot on the bookshelf. She wrote, I don't know the details of your situation, but I know what it is to be told that what you are doesn't count. And I want you to know that it does. Someone is standing with you who has been exactly where you are and who came out the other side. Carol Vaith is good. Trust her and trust yourself. She signed it, Vivian Marsh, Millhaven. She sealed it and gave it to Carol to forward. Then she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the apple trees, which were in their first week of bloom, white flowers on bare branches before the leaves arrived. And she thought about Bernard on a Saturday morning in April, parking on the gravel, walking up to this door, unlocking it, walking across the yard to the stone building with his keys. She thought, I understand you better now than I did when you were here. I am still a little angry about the 36 hours. I am still a little angry about the motel room in the dark. And I love you. I love you exactly the way I always have, entirely with all the complication that comes with it. And I would not change it, even the parts that cost me something I cannot get back. The apple trees were white outside the window. The watercolor caught the morning light the way he had known it would when he bought it in 1983 and thought of her garden. And Vivian stood at the window of the house her husband had prepared for her, in secret over 11 years, and she felt, for the first time since a Thursday morning in October when a man sat down at her kitchen table without being asked, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. What Vivian's letter kept making me think about is how much love goes unexplained. Bernard didn't leave a note with reasons. He left a brass key and a stone room full of 30 years of quiet care, and he trusted her to understand it when she was ready. She had to drive 41 miles and sit in a building she'd never seen to understand what he had been trying to say. Every letter I receive reminds me of the same thing. The people the world gives up on are often the ones who were worth the most all along. If you've ever discovered something about someone you loved, after it was too late to ask them why, I want to hear your story. Leave it in the comments. I read everyone. And if this letter stayed with you, stay with us. There are more letters.